Hi, and welcome to Barely Homesteading. Today we're going to be finishing up a project that we've been working on for a couple of weeks, some bathroom shelves, but the bathroom shelves aren't the important thing that we're going to talk about. Stay tuned and you'll find out what is special about these bathroom shelves. I normally wouldn't do a video on something as simple as a shelf. Mama Bear wants a couple of shelves put up in our bathroom, and I just have a piece of pine, scrap pine that I had lying around. I've cut it to length. I've routed the edges already. But since this particular board had this really interesting crack in it, I've decided to try something that I haven't done before. It's going to be an experiment. I'm going to try to fill that crack with colored epoxy and then stain the board and polyurethane it and see how it turns out. So this is going to be an experiment, and I figured I would invite all of you to come along with me on it. I've already sanded the board and blown it off with the air compressor. So prior to doing the epoxy, I'm going to seal the bottom of this with some tape because I don't know if the epoxy is actually going to go through this crack all the way or not, but I don't want it to run all over my workbench. So I'm going to seal this off so that if it does make it all the way through, it doesn't make a mess. All right, let's mix up the epoxy. We've got our epoxy mixed, and I've got a blue pigment that I've added to it. I'm going to try to make the epoxy, the crack that I'm epoxying, kind of pop from the stain that I'm going to do the wood after the epoxy dries. So we're going to apply the epoxy. I've got a tape dam over here. All right, so I've got the epoxy applied to both boards. I'm going to let it settle and then make sure, come back in probably 10-15 minutes after it's had a chance to level out and see if I need to apply any more to fill in the gaps now that the epoxy has been able to work its way into the crack. Now that the epoxy is set in these shelves, I'm ready to take off the excess and then give them another sand. After that, we will finish them. I'm going to stain and then polyurethane them. And so to strip off the excess, we're going to use a heat gun. And if you don't have a heat gun, if you've got a really good hair dryer, that might work, or a paint stripper, which this is actually a paint stripper, that'll work as well. And then we're going to heat up the epoxy, and then we're going to use a chisel to scrape it off. Alright, so hopefully you can see this actually turned out pretty well. I think when I do the next one, I'm going to try a metal paint scraper rather than the chisel. Had some issues with the chisel catching the grain of the pine and pulling out little chunks of pine. But overall, I'm fairly pleased. Couple of little air bubbles in the epoxy, but hopefully those will fill in with polyurethane and won't be too visible. So do the other side and see how that works out. So I'm much happier with the metal scraper, the metal paint scraper, as opposed to the chisel. It didn't catch the wood and take big chunks out like the chisel did. I'm actually going to let this cool before I sand it in hopes that with the harder epoxy it sands a little better. On the other side, I noticed that the sandpaper was gumming up quite a bit, and I'm hoping that if the epoxy is a little harder, it won't happen quite so much. So I'm going to go ahead and scrape the other board while I let this one cool off. We've removed the excess epoxy and sanded the board. You can see the blue epoxy streak there in the crack. Looks pretty nice. There are some air holes, air bubbles, air pockets there in the surface. So after I sanded this really well, I blew them out with the air compressor to try to clean them all out. Hopefully it won't capture a lot of stain, because that's what we're going to do next, is stain this and ruin the epoxy. We're going to find out right now. So I think that looks pretty good. The stain, that red stain, really helps the blue epoxy to pop. And there is a little bit of epoxy, or a stain I should say, in those air pockets. I'll see if I can get those cleaned out before it dries and can't get it out. So the epoxy shelves are now done. I finished the last coat of polyurethane, and you can see that epoxy in the crack looks pretty good. Now I got a little anxious with the finishing, and so there's some sanding marks, and the finishing was rushed because I was anxious to find out how this epoxy was going to turn out, and I'm actually pretty pleased with it. So let's get these shelves up on the wall and mounted so we can start using them. Now the bathroom shelves are installed. We did it a little bit different than I normally would have. On the bottom shelf, I've got the routed molding edge up, and then on the top shelf, I've got it down. And the reason why is because the epoxy that shows through on both of these, I wanted the best looking side up, and those were the two best sides. Alright, so we got the shelves put into the bathroom, and I wanted to take just a minute to talk about what I learned about epoxy and dealing with epoxy. So probably the main thing that I learned with the epoxy is temperature. Temperature is everything. So when mixing the epoxy, we want to make sure that we have both the epoxy resin and the hardener up to room temperature, 75-80 degrees, before mixing it. After we mix it and we pour it, we want to keep that wood and epoxy in again a warm temperature, 75-80 degrees, so that the air bubbles can work their way out quickly before the epoxy starts to harden. And then in removing the excess epoxy from the wood, temperature is also key. We want to have a heat gun or a really good hair dryer to be able to heat that epoxy up, scrape it off easily. And so some lessons learned for me. I did not get the resin and the epoxy up to temperature before mixing it on my first pour, and I also didn't bring it into the house after pouring it to keep it up at temperature, and so got a lot of air bubbles trapped in there as I was finishing it. They showed through. They weren't able to work their way out. Even with the second pour on the opposite side of the shelf, even though I brought the epoxy, the resin and the hardener up to temperature before mixing it, still had some problems because I didn't keep it inside the house because I didn't want the kids playing with it and getting epoxy everywhere. That would be bad. So temperature's key. The other thing that I found with the epoxy is that it actually finishes really well. I got a nice smooth finish only with 120 grit sandpaper. It was actually a really nice finish, and it took the water-based polyurethane really well as a top coat for it, and so I was really pleased with that. And I definitely will be doing the epoxy again on future projects. We'll have to see what those will be. So for Beardsley Homesteading, this is Lumberjack, and remember, use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without.